Hey, good morning. It's Tuesday, and this is Bill. And because it's Tuesday morning, I've got something to think about. In this series, Something to Think About, I've been discussing and challenging us to pursue the development of our character. That is, who we are in the deepest part of us. I've talked about forgiveness, about being fair, about being honest and trustworthy, being reliable and respectful, being understanding and humble, and holding fast and valuing these intertwined pieces of who we are and who we want to become. The challenge is to not allow these just to become words on a checklist, but to have them so ingrained that people will be attracted to our character and want to know where it comes from. We exist in a world of cultural, trendy buzzwords. In these last few years, we've heard words like empowered, proactive, woke, ghosting, adulting, pivot, clickbait, going viral, hashtag, meme, trolling, and unpack. In the corporate world, there's another buzzword. It's an important word. And that word is empathy. There's much discussion about empathy and compassion. Are these the same? Are they different? Is one more important? If so, which one? And though there are some similarities and some differences in character development, both of these are essential. So I want to weave these two together so that we don't tend to prioritize one over the other. In the website Skills You Need, they define empathy as feeling with someone, being able to put yourself in their place as if you were them and feeling those feelings. They suggest there are several different elements that make up empathy. And the author explains how and why it is possible to demonstrate one or more of these three types of empathy and yet still come across as uncaring. The first is cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy, also known as perspective taking, is not really what most of us would think of as empathy at all. Cognitive empathy is basically being able to put yourself into someone else's place and see their perspective. It's a useful skill, particularly in negotiations, for example, or for managers. It enables us to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, but without necessarily engaging in their emotions. It doesn't really fit with the definition of empathy as feeling with being a much more rational and logical process. Effectively, cognitive empathy is empathy by thought rather than empathy by feeling. There can also be a dark side to cognitive empathy. It's possible to show cognitive empathy without having any appropriate feeling or sympathy with the other person. Daniel Goleman, who wrote Emotional Intelligence, notes in his blog that torturers would need to have good cognitive empathy to work out how best to hurt someone, but without having any sympathy toward them. The second type is emotional empathy. That's when you quite literally feel the other person's emotions alongside them as if you had caught the emotions like you would catch a cold. Emotional empathy is also known as personal distress or emotional contagion. This is closer to the usual understanding of the word empathy, but more emotional. Emotional empathy can be good and bad. Emotional empathy is good when it means we can readily understand and feel other people's emotions. This is vital for those in caring professions like doctors and nurses to be able to respond to their patients appropriately. It means that we can also respond to friends and others in times of distress. But emotional empathy can be bad. It's bad when it's possible to become overwhelmed by those emotions and therefore unable to respond. This is called empathy overload or enmeshment. Those with a tendency to become overwhelmed need to work on their self-regulation, or what we often call establishing healthy boundaries, and particularly their self-control, so that they can become better at managing their own emotions. Good self-control helps doctors and nurses to avoid burnout from empathizing too much. There's a danger, however, that they can become hardened and not respond appropriately at all. There have been cases around the globe where doctors and nurses were accused of being uncaring. This is probably a result of overprotection against empathy overload. Many in the medical profession today are dealing with burnout daily. But beyond burnout lies compassion fatigue. Burnout is the loss of the ability to care for myself. Compassion fatigue is the loss of the ability to care about you. And since most people enter nursing in order to care for others, this creates quite a crisis in their lives and is a cause for high turnover of nurses every year. The third type of empathy is compassionate empathy. This is what we usually understand by empathy. It's feeling someone's pain and taking action to help. Empathy, feeling, compassionate, taking action. The name compassionate empathy is consistent with what we usually understand by compassion. Like sympathy, compassion is about feeling concern for someone, but with the additional move toward action to mitigate the problem. Compassionate empathy is a type of empathy that is usually most appropriate. As a general rule, people who want or need your empathy don't just need you to understand, cognitive empathy. They certainly don't need you just to feel their pain or worse, burst into tears alongside of them, emotional empathy. But they need you to understand and sympathize with what they're going through, and then, crucially, either take or help them take action to resolve the problem. That's compassionate empathy. There's a fourth type of empathy. To complete this list, it's worth mentioning that many people suggest there is a spiritual empathy. And that's defined as a direct connection of how God would understand the trials and traumas of a person and would seek to respond or enact in a way that honors him. 1 Peter 3:8 is a verse about empathy. All of you be of one mind. Spiritual empathy might be best described in this way. It's understanding who they are, how they became that person, what they know, how they learned it, what they hold dear and why they hold it dear, how they feel and why they feel that way. That oneness is created by treating one another with compassion, love, tenderness, and courtesy. These are at the heart of empathy. Oneness is created by treating one another with compassion, love, tenderness, and courtesy. Maya Angelou said this, "I think we all have empathy. We may not have enough courage to display it." Empathy is critical to our character. That which makes us us in the deepest parts of who we want to be requires empathy. I'd suggest that without empathy, None of the other parts of our character matter. I'm Bill. I'm glad we're friends. I love you, and this has been something to think about.